Story 1. Lost cities along the Niger River you've never heard of are standing on the high bank of a broad, slow-moving river. The water here is not in a hurry, it folds and unfolds over itself, like an old sheet being smoothed by invisible hands. This is the Niger, and if you follow it far enough, you will find that it holds more than fish, more than silt, more than the green fringe of reeds that cling to its edges. It holds the memory of cities you have likely never heard of, because history forgot to keep them in its main chapters. You might picture ancient ruins as grand, stone-faced monuments with columns and carvings that tourists photograph. But along the Niger, some cities vanished without leaving much to see. The river's great curve, which arches like a bent elbow across West Africa, once hosted settlements so bustling with trade, song, and ritual that their absence now feels like an error in the world's memory. The first city you'll meet, though, you cannot meet it in the usual ways called Kukia. Long before Gao rose to prominence, Kukia sat quietly upriver, built not of stone but of sun-dried mud brick. The air would have been full of the sound of wooden pestles thudding grain. In large mortar, the smell of millet beer brewing in clay jars. Fishermen in dugout canoes would glide in at dawn, their nets heavy, with silver tilapia that shone briefly before being salted and laid out to dry. Kukia's prosperity did not come from gold or ivory, but from knowing the river. Its elders could read the slow pulse of the floods and knew which shallow channels would stay open longest in the dry season. In a world without printed maps, this was a living cartography, a memory stored in minds, passed down in patient conversation that you walk in your mind along Kukia's vanished streets. You notice the rhythm of ordinary life. Women weaving baskets from reeds, children herding goats through narrow alleys, traders unloading sacks of smoked fish. The work was repetitive, unhurried, and necessary. It is perhaps no wonder that few chroniclers pause to describe it in detail. There were no battles worth recording here, no palace intrigues to scandalize future readers. And yet, without such steady, uneventful labor, the river's trade routes would have faltered downriver. There was Kabara, the once busy port of Timbuktu. If you stood on its docks in the 15th century, you would see camels arriving dusty from the Sahara, their burdens heavy with salt blocks. From here, the goods would be loaded onto riverboats, long, narrow pirogues that skimmed the surface with shallow drafts. Kabara was not a city in the grand sense, it was a hinge. The desert met the river here, and the exchange was wordless, but vital. But perhaps the most haunting of these forgotten cities is Daya. Even now, the name sounds like a breath. Daya's walls were of mud, but its mosques rose in graceful tiers, their facades dotted with wooden beams that both supported and decorated the structure. Its scholars studied the Quran under the shade of acacia trees, their ink made from soot mixed with gum, Arabic. The city was known for its patience in trade, patience in teaching, patience in the endless maintenance of earthen buildings during the rainy season. The problem with earthen cities is that they can disappear without fanfare. A stone city may leave its skeleton for centuries, but mud, if neglected, returns quickly to the earth. Floods reshape the land. Wind lifts dust from forgotten streets and deposits it elsewhere. By the time later travelers passed through, the outlines of walls were nothing more than faint rises in the soil. The story of these cities is not one of sudden catastrophe. Rather, it is the story of slow changes, trade routes shifting, riverbanks eroding, political centers moving elsewhere. The Niger's flow itself has changed over time, carving new paths, abandoning old ones. A port left high and dry by a changing channel can no longer serve its purpose. And without purpose, a city slowly exhales its population into the surrounding countryside. You might imagine standing on a quiet bend of the river today, where tall grasses sway in the breeze. Beneath your feet, there may be shards of pottery still waiting to be found, though most have already been ground back into the soil. The ghosts of marketplaces and prayer halls are here, but they no longer speak loudly. The past is muffled by silt and by the simple passage of time. To know these cities is to understand that history is not only made of decisive battles or the reigns of kings. It is also made of people who get up every morning to repeat the same tasks as the day before stirring porridge, patching roofs, mending nets, teaching verses, measuring grain. These things do not often make it into grand historical accounts, but they are the substance that keeps a civilization alive. And so, when we speak of the Niger's lost cities, we are not speaking of ruins alone. We are speaking of the river's capacity to nourish and then quietly reclaim, to sustain for centuries and then move on as if turning a page. The cities were not abandoned in anger or fear. They simply became unnecessary in a shifting web of human needs. What remains is a sense of absence, a soft gap in the map. If you trace the river on a chart, you can point to where each city once was, but the landscape offers little confirmation. That gap invites questions, and perhaps that is why such places, though boring by the standards of popular history, are worth lingering over. They remind you that most of human life is built on the unremarkable, and that the unremarkable, given enough time, can vanish almost without notice. And so you stand here, in your mind, on the riverbank. The air is still. Somewhere upriver, the evening call to prayer is answered by the sound of oars dipping into the water. Somewhere beneath the surface of this calm brown river, there are stories silted over, waiting for the patient hand of history to brush them clear again. But when they are uncovered, what will they tell us and what will they leave unsaid? The Niger River has always been more than a line of water running across a map. It is a moving archive, a conveyor of memory. If you could follow its flow as a historian follows the margins of an old manuscript, you would see faint annotations where cities once stood. These annotations are not carved in stone. They are written in silt, and the river edits them with the slow patience of centuries. In Section 1, we spoke of Kukia, Kabara, and Dio3, of many names that have slipped beneath the surface of common knowledge. But to truly understand how these cities could rise and vanish, you have to look at the wider world they were part of. Each city was a knot in a larger network, and that network stretched farther than most imagine. Imagine a trader leaving the salt mines of Taudani in the deep Sahara, his camels packed with slabs of salt so heavy that they must be loaded in pairs to balance the animals. For weeks, the caravan moves slowly southward, sand yielding gradually to scrub to the first hints of cultivated fields. The trader's goal might not even be the coast, it might be one of the Niger's bustling ports, where his salt could be traded for grain, cloth, or cola nuts. These ports were not just places to load and unload goods. They were junctions of culture. A man might arrive speaking Hassania Arabic, and within days he would be haggling in Songhai or Feld. The markets themselves were lessons in geography, piles of dried fish from upstream villages, gourds of shea butter from wooded regions, baskets of indigo cloth dyed in far-off Hausa towns. Kukia and its neighbors thrived because they fit into this rhythm. They were not exceptional in wealth or size compared to the great capitals, but they were dependable. Traders knew that if they reached Kukia, there would be food, shelter, and a chance to find buyers. In the slow economy of pre-modern West Africa, where a single transaction might take days of conversation, dependability was its own kind of currency. But rivers are restless. A channel that was deep enough for boats one year might silt up the next. This was not merely an inconvenience, it could reroute entire patterns of movement. When a port's access to the main current became unreliable, merchants began to favor other stops. At first, it might just be the larger cargoes that went elsewhere, then the regular caravans, and finally even the smaller traders. Without constant traffic, the market would thin out. Without a market, the city's reason for existing would wither. The slow decline of such cities rarely drew the attention of court chroniclers. After all, the fall of an empire was worth a chapter, but the gradual emptiness of a riverside port was little more than a footnote. It is left to archaeologists, centuries later, to piece together fragment ceramic shards that suggest trade links, carbon-dated charcoal from cooking fires, beads of glass that may have crossed half a continent before coming to rest in the soil. One of the most intriguing things about these lost Niger cities is how they navigated the border between land and water. Their architecture had to contend with seasonal floods, so houses were often raised on small earthen mounds. Streets might be little more than narrow footpaths, winding between compounds. The walls were made from banka mud, mixed with straw and kneaded by hand before being packed into forms to dry under the sun. Banko buildings require constant care. After the rains, cracks must be patched, corners reinforced. In larger cities, like Timbuktu, annual festivals of maintenance still exist. Neighbors gather to replaster mosques and public walls. In smaller settlements, the same tradition would have kept homes intact for generations. But once a city's population shrank below a certain point, there were too few hands to keep up with the repairs. You can picture the process. A once busy street gradually narrows as collapsed walls spill into the pathway. Roof beams rot where the plaster has fallen away. A family leaves for a more prosperous town, locking their door with a simple wooden peg. A season later, the door hangs open, the threshold filled with wind-blown sand. Another rainy season comes, and the house is gone, folded back into the earth it was made from. It's easy to think of such endings as tragic, but for the people of the time, they may have been less dramatic. To move along the river was part of life. A family might have roots in several towns, spending seasons in one and then another, depending on trade, farming cycles, or political stability. The loss of a particular settlement was not the end of their world. It was a shift, like the changing of a channel. Still, some traces remained stubbornly in place. A ruined mosque might be left standing because it was considered a sacred site, even if the surrounding houses vanished. A grove of trees planted for shade in the marketplace might survive long after the market was gone. Even the river's own shifts could preserve memory. Fishermen might still speak of the bend at Daya, long after Daya itself was a ghost. We know about many of these cities today because of a mixture of written records, oral history, and archaeology. The written records are often fragmentary travelers, like Ibn Battuta mentioned certain places in passing, while administrative documents from the Mali and Songhai empires sometimes listed ports as points for tax collection. Oral histories, told by griots and passed through families, can preserve names and events long after the physical traces have faded. Archaeology adds the tangible proof, the shape of a foundation, the style of a pot, the residue in an ancient grain silo. Yet there are surely cities we still do not know about, ones whose names have not survived in any form. The Niger's great bend was once thick with life, and not every place left a trail that could be followed. Some are simply gone, their stories erased by floods, droughts, or the quiet indifference of time. As you think about these lost cities, you might notice how many of their stories are not about grand gestures, but about maintenance, the daily work of keeping a roof from leaking, a boat from rotting, a trade route from being forgotten. This is history in its slowest form, the kind of history that rarely makes headlines but shapes everything else. Without the quiet endurance of these towns, the great empires upriver and downriver would have lacked the connective tissue that kept them. Functioning. Standing again in your mind on that quiet riverbank, you might feel the urge to walk along the shore to see if the next bend reveals a trace of a wall or the outline of a street. But the Niger is a patient keeper of secrets. It does not give them up easily, and when it does so on its own time. Somewhere, beneath the reeds and the slow current, there is a question, forming a question about the cities we do not yet know, the lives that never made it into the record books. What if the most important parts of history are the ones we have not yet uncovered? The Niger River begins far to the west, in the green highlands of modern Guinea, before bending like an enormous sickle through Mali, Niger, and into Nigeria. If you were to travel its length by slow boat, you would notice that it is not a uniform river but a chain of different worlds linked by water. In each of those worlds there were cities, some large and famed, others small and uncelebrated. We've traced the outlines of places like Kukia and Daya, where commerce flowed in measured rhythms and life was woven into the changing moods of the river. We've seen how these settlements rose not through sudden conquest or a ruler's decree, but through steady usefulness, safe landing, a reliable market, a reputation for fairness in trade. Now, to complete this picture, we have to consider what happens after a city's name slips from memory, when the population thinned and the market stalls stood empty. When the mosque walls began to lean under the weight of neglect, these places didn't collapse in an instant. Their decline was slow, almost seasonal. Families would depart in ones and twos, often returning to help with harvest or religious festivals. Neighbors might meet by chance in another port, sharing news of the old home before going their separate ways again. This gradual dispersal had an unusual effect. The cities may have vanished as physical spaces, but they survived as networks of people. A trader from Kukia might settle in Gao, still carrying in his head the knowledge of the upstream channels. A woman from Daya might marry into a Timbuktu family, bringing with her the particular weaving style of her birthplace. Culture traveled with the people, and so, in a way, the cities never entirely died. Archaeologists sometimes speak of ghost layers in the soil strata, where artifacts appear without clear context, as if they arrived already in motion. These ghost layers may well be the traces of people from abandoned towns resettling elsewhere, their possessions mingling with the material culture of their new homes. In this sense, the Niger's lost cities did not disappear. They dissolved into the broader life of the region. The river itself, indifferent to human settlements, continued its patient work. Seasonal floods carved away at old banks, uncovering and then burying fragments of the past. In the rainy season, a current might carry a broken pot hundreds of kilometers downstream before lodging it in a sandbar, where it might remain unseen for centuries. In the dry season, the river shrank to reveal mudflats and islets. perhaps exposing the remnants of a long-collapsed quay. Local fishermen and farmers sometimes stumbled upon such remnants. A lump of hardened clay might turn out to be part of a wall. A peculiar stone, out of place in a land of mud architecture, might have been ballast from a boat that arrived centuries ago. These finds rarely left the community. They might be kept as curiosities, or simply returned to the earth. The idea that they belonged to history in the formal sense was less important than the quiet acknowledgement that others had lived here before. Oral tradition remained the most enduring map of the Niger's vanished cities. Elders would tell children about the town that once stood 3 days upriver, or beyond the bend where the hippos sleep. These stories might mix fact with memory, memory with imagination, until the boundaries blurred. A city could shrink in the telling, becoming no more than a cluster of huts. Or it could grow into a place of legendary wealth, visited by caravans from the ends of the earth. Both versions carried a truth not about the exact size or wealth of the place, but about the role it played in the imagination of those who remembered it. Modern historians, sifting through these fragments, often face a paradox. The more one studies these cities, the more one realizes how much cannot be known. A layer of pottery can reveal what people ate, but not the jokes they told over their meals. A collapsed wall can suggest the size of a mosque, but not the tone of the voice that led the prayer. And yet, perhaps this is fitting. The Niger's lost cities were never about grand spectacle. They were about endurance, the kind of endurance that doesn't demand to be remembered in precise detail. Their true legacy may be this: a reminder that human life has always depended on countless quiet places that were never meant to dominate the stage. Picture yourself again on the bank of the Niger, but now in the cool of early morning. Mist rises from the surface, softening the outlines of the opposite shore. Somewhere upstream, the faint sound of paddles drifts toward you. A fisherman passes, standing at the stern of his canoe, scanning the water for the flash of fish. He does not think of Kukia or Daya or Kabara. His work is the same whether they stood or not. But unknowingly, he is part of the same continuum, drawing on knowledge that has passed down the river for hundreds of years. As the sun climbs higher, the mist fades and the river turns a brighter brown. You can almost see how the curve of this waterway could cradle a city, how a cluster of houses might rise and fall here over generations. And you can feel how easily that same city might vanish again, leaving behind nothing but a change in the current, a whisper in the reeds. The Niger's lost cities are gone in the physical sense, but they remain present in a more subtle way, woven into the habits of trade, the patterns of speech, the shared memory of a people who have always lived with the river's shifting moods. And so, when we speak of them today, we are not reviving ruins. We are acknowledging that history is not only what survives in stone, but also what survives in water, in silt, and in the minds of those who keep moving forward. Perhaps that is the final gift of these quiet, forgotten places, to remind us that even in absence, there can be influence. Even in silence, there can be a story. And it leaves you with one more question. Soft as the river's own voice, if so much of the past can live on without walls or streets or names, how much of our present will endure in ways we cannot yet imagine? Story 2. How Songhai River pilots memorized every sandbank. It is early morning on the Niger, and the light has the pale gold of water seen through a thin layer of mist. The river is broad here, but it is not as simple as it looks. Beneath the surface, there is a shifting map channels that run deep and steady, and others that end abruptly in a hidden ridge of sand. A stranger might not see the danger until it grinds the bottom of their boat to a halt. But a Songhai River pilot would know it without looking. In the centuries when the Songhai Empire ruled much of the western Sahel, river transport was the fastest way to move goods and people between cities. The empire's heart was the stretch of the Niger between Timbuktu and Gao, but the river was as treacherous as it was useful. Sandbanks appeared and vanished with the seasons. A safe passage in June might be a dead end by August. A channel wide enough for a cargo boat at the height of the flood might be too shallow for even a canoe once the water fell. To navigate this constantly changing landscape, the Songhai relied on men who were part sailor, part cartographer, and part storyteller. These were the Kaurifari, the pilots of the river. They could guide a loaded pirogue through a maze of shallows without once dipping a pole to measure the depth. They carried no paper charts, for paper was rare and maps quickly outdated. Their maps were, in their minds, stored not as static pictures, but as living, breathing narratives. A pilot might describe a safe channel by saying, "Keep the tall tamarind to your right until the current pulls stronger, then aim for the cluster of rocks shaped like a crocodile's back. Turn before the last rock, or the sand will take you." The instructions sounded like a parable, but they were precise. Each landmark a tree, a rock, even the shape of a cloud bank during a certain season was part of a code only other pilots fully understood. Learning this code took years. A boy might begin as an oarsman, working the middle of the boat under the watchful eye of the pilot. At first, his job was simple: row when told, bail water when it splashed over the side, and keep quiet when the pilot was listening to the river. Gradually, he would be allowed to stand at the prow, scanning for the telltale ripples that marked a sandbank. His questions would be answered in fragments, often with a gesture or a nod rather than a lecture. The training was seasonal. In the flood months, the river was a different creature, wide, restless, and faster than most men could swim. In the dry months, its spine of sand and rock was exposed, forcing boats into narrow, twisting channels. The apprentice learned each version of the river, knowing that neither would last long. The pilots also kept track of the river's mood through sound. A certain hollow slap of water against the hull might mean the current was bouncing off a hidden bank. A low hiss might signal that the flow was constricted between rocks. This sound map was especially useful at night, when moonlight was the only guide. In the days before clocks or precise calendars, pilots marked time by the river's own schedule. They knew when the rains in the far-off Fouta Jalan highlands would send the floodwaters downstream, and how many weeks it would take for the surge to reach their stretch of the Niger. This knowledge was more than convenience, it was survival. A merchant boat caught in the wrong part of the river during the flood might be stranded for months. The work was not without danger. A boat grounded on a sandbank could be swamped by the current, its cargo ruined. Worse still were the places where crocodiles lingered in the shallows, waiting for fish or something larger. Pilots steered not only for depth but for safety, knowing which bends of the river were less likely to harbor the big reptiles. And yet, despite the hazards, the river pilots were not considered heroes. They were respected in a quiet way, as men who possessed a skill that others needed but rarely celebrated. When a boat arrived safely with its load of grain, salt, or cloth, the merchant might thank the pilot with a share of the profits, but the real reward was more subtle: the acknowledgement that the pilot's knowledge had been confirmed once again by the river itself. What made the pilot's craft so remarkable was its impermanence. A route memorized in one season might be useless in the next. Sand moved, trees fell. A new rock might appear where none had been before, thrown up by the restless current. The map in a pilot's mind was never finished. It was rewritten each day, each trip, each turn of the river. If you close your eyes, you can picture it. A long pirogue, loaded with sacks of millet and baskets of dried fish, gliding silently between walls of green reeds. At the stern, the pilot stands with a long steering oar, his gaze fixed far ahead. He is not thinking in miles or minutes, but in markers how many breaths to the next turn. How the current should feel against the hull at this bend, where the shadow of a certain tree will fall at this hour. The passengers, perhaps merchants heading to Gao's great market, might chat quietly or doze in the heat. They do not watch the river closely. That is the pilot's job. To them, the trip is a means to an end. To the pilot, it is a conversation with an old and changeable friend, one he must greet anew each time. As the boat rounds a bend, the water changes color darker now, with a hint of green. The pilot shifts his weight, adjusting the oar. The apprentice at the prow points to a smooth patch of water. The pilot shakes his head almost imperceptibly. That smoothness hides a bar that would ground them in seconds. The boat slides instead into the rougher water, where the current runs deep and true dot by nightfall. They will tie up at a small riverside village, where the pilot will eat with the local elders and trade news about the river's condition. This too is part of the work. No pilot is an island. The river's stories are shared, so that tomorrow's journey can be made a little safer. And so the knowledge of every sandbank, every hidden snag, and every shifting channel passes from one generation to the next, not in books, but in memory. In the slow rhythm of oars dipping into the water, the river pilots knew the Niger as intimately as some know the streets of their own hometowns. But unlike a street, the river is never the same twice. And that raises a question that lingers as the boat drifts downstream. How do you preserve a map that changes every time you look at it? If you wanted to understand a Songhai River pilot's mind, you would have to begin with the idea that the Niger was never a single river. To the untrained eye, it was one continuous ribbon of water. But to a pilot, it was many rivers layered atop each other, one for each season, each water level, each wind direction. In the high flood, when the rains from the distant Photojalan swelled its flow, the river might spread 2 or 3 times its normal width, swallowing fields and villages on its banks. A pilot in these months became part explorer, navigating over ground that, for most of the year, had been dry. New routes opened, but new hazards appeared too. Half-submerged trees, disoriented hippos, whole mats of vegetation drifting downstream. Like rafts, by contrast, in the low-water months, the Niger was a gaunt shadow of itself, narrow and slow, its bed exposed in pale ridges of sand. In this season, the danger was not surprise obstacles, but the sheer difficulty of finding a path deep enough for a loaded boat. Pilots would sometimes send a boy ahead on foot along the shallows, pole in hand, probing the depth before signaling the safest track to follow. This constant variability meant that a pilot's memory had to be alive, more like a song that could change in performance than a static image. He might recall that in the last dry season, a certain bend hid a deep pool where fish gathered, but this year the pool might be gone, filled with sand, and another might have appeared downstream. It was not enough to remember the river. One had to observe it anew each time. And so, the training of a pilot's apprentice was built around watching the way the current curled around a point of land, watching the way reeds bent in the flow, revealing where the water ran fastest, watching the color of the water shift from brown to green and back again. Sometimes the lessons were hidden in ordinary conversation. An elder pilot might say, "If the cattle are grazing close to the bank here, the sandbar ahead is growing." It sounded like small talk, but it was a coded observation. Cattle preferred certain grasses that only flourished when the river's edge had shifted. Pilots also learned from each other in ways that resembled the passing of oral tradition. At night, around the small fires lit on the riverbank, stories were told not only for entertainment but for navigation. A tale about a boat that nearly capsized in the place of the two crocodiles was to a fellow pilot a warning about a particular narrow pass, where the current split violently around two large rocks. These informal maps were enriched by the experience of riverfolk beyond the pilots themselves. Fishermen, farmers, ferrymen, and even children swimming near the bank could offer clues about changes in the river's behavior. A pilot's skill was as much in gathering these fragments of knowledge as in steering a boat. The pilots of the Songhai period served a world that was wider than the river itself. The Niger was the empire's spine, but its ribs were the caravan routes, the overland paths, and the forest trails that connected distant regions. A shipment of grain might leave the inland delta by boat, be offloaded onto camels at Gao, and travel hundreds of kilometers into the Sahara. Conversely, salt from the desert would arrive at ports along the river and continue downstream to the fertile farmlands. The pilot was a link in this chain, as vital to the flow of goods as the merchant or the caravan leader, and yet his profession was also precarious. A pilot's reputation depended entirely on his most recent voyages. One grounding in a sandbank, especially if it damaged a merchant's cargo, could tarnish years of good work. A man known for misjudging the river might soon find himself without clients. This pressure meant that pilots developed habits of extreme caution. They preferred to travel at certain times of day, often in the early morning when the wind was gentle and the light revealed the faint ripples over shallow spots. They avoided stretches where the water was muddied by upstream rain, which could hide obstacles. They carried long poles not just for steering, but for probing ahead in questionable waters. One of the more curious aspects of their craft was the use of sound at night. Without light to read the water's surface, pilots relied on the feel of the current against the hull and the sounds it made. A change in pitch from a deep, slow slap to a quicker, sharper patter could mean a sudden change in depth. The pilot would adjust course instinctively, trusting the language of the river's voice. It is easy to romanticize this kind of skill, but for the pilots themselves, it was simply the way things were done. They did not see their work as art or mystery. It was knowledge gained through repetition, failure, and patience. The kind of knowledge that leaves no written trace, but survives as long as there are people to keep practicing it. Some pilots passed this legacy to their sons, but not all. In times of political change, when the Songhai Empire weakened, when Moroccan forces arrived, when new trade routes bypassed old ones, the profession could become less secure. A young man might decide that his future lay in trading goods on land or in farming, rather than taking on the hazards of the river. As the generations turned, certain stretches of the Niger lost their pilots entirely. Without regular traffic, the knowledge of every sandbank faded. The river reclaimed its secrets, reshaping the channels until even the most skilled boatman would have to relearn them from scratch. You might picture this knowledge as a kind of fragile net, spread over the water. Every time a pilot guided a boat safely, he reinforced the net. Every time a season passed without a voyage, a few threads loosened. And once enough threads were gone, the net vanished, not with a dramatic break, but with a quiet unraveling, standing. On the bank today, you can still imagine the pilots of old. You might see them leaning on their long oars, eyes scanning the horizon. You might hear their voices, low and even, calling to the rowers. You might even feel, in the way the current shifts under your feet, the echoes of the maps they carried in their minds. But you also might wonder if a craft depends entirely on living memory. What happens when the last person who remembers it is gone? If you were to walk along the Niger's banks today, you might still find pilots, men and women, guiding narrow wooden pirogues between villages. But the world of the Niger River pilot, the Rai, exists now only in fragments. The modern river is a place of motors and fiberglass hulls. Many boats follow predictable channels mapped with GPS. Yet even now, in stretches where the technology is unreliable or the fuel is scarce, the old skills reappear. A man might lean over the side of his boat, watching the shade of the water change, feeling for the tug of the current beneath the keel. He may not call himself a pilot in the old sense, but the gestures are the same. In the Songhai centuries, this craft had been a quiet form of authority. The empire's rulers in Gao might send armies, levy taxes, and dictate the trade in gold and salt. But a single river pilot determined whether a merchant's cargo would arrive in good condition or not at all. Without them, the empire's internal arteries would clog, and yet these men left almost no written record. They are invisible in the chronicles, mentioned only in passing. Historians know of their existence from context. Someone must have steered the fleets. Someone must have carried news from port to port. But the chroniclers preferred to write of kings and battles, not of the man who knew the safe channel past. The sandbank shaped like a heron's wing. This absence in the record mirrors the nature of their work, impermanent, constantly shifting, resistant to being fixed in place. To write down a pilot's map was to risk it being wrong within a season. The better map was in the mind, where it could be altered as the river altered itself. That adaptability was the essence of the craft. A pilot never believed that last year's knowledge was enough for this year. He expected the river to have changed. He approached each voyage as though meeting an old friend who might have grown a new scar or taken up a new habit. The learning never stopped. Even an experienced pilot would listen carefully when meeting others along the way. Perhaps a ferry operator had noticed that a channel near his village had narrowed after the rains. Perhaps a fisherman had struck a new rock with his net. Every bit of information was a thread to weave into the invisible net of the pilot's mental map. There was also a spiritual dimension to this life, though it was not always spoken of openly. Many pilots made small offerings before setting out, a handful of grain cast into the water, a whispered prayer to the river spirits. It was not superstition in the simple sense, but an acknowledgement that the river had moods beyond human control. No matter how skilled you were, you remained at the river's mercy. Over time, as the Songhai Empire waned and new powers rose, the demands on the pilots shifted. Moroccan control after the late 16th century disrupted old trade patterns. Caravans were redirected, and some stretches of the river lost their strategic importance. In these places, pilots became ferrymen or fishermen, their specialized craft blending into the more general life of the riverfolk. Even so, in the busiest corridors of the Niger, the tradition lingered. Into the 19th century, European explorers and colonial officers sometimes remarked on local boatmen who could steer without ever touching a sounding pole, who could recall precisely where the water deepened or where it snagged on hidden roots. These men were the descendants of the Kaurifari, keeping alive a skill that had survived through centuries of political and economic change. Today, when scholars and local historians speak of the Songhai pilots, they often focus on their practical value, how they moved goods, how they kept commerce alive. But there is another lesson to draw from them, one less visible but perhaps more enduring: the ability to live in sync with a world that will not stand still. The river pilots did not try to force the Niger into a fixed pattern. They learned to read its changes and adapt to them. They accepted that a safe channel today might be a trap tomorrow. And so they approached the river with humility as well as skill. That balance between knowledge and flexibility, between confidence and caution, was their true mastery. Imagine again the long pirogue, its bow cutting a gentle line through the current. The pilot stands at the stern, his eyes scanning far ahead, the sweep of his oar as steady as the river's own pulse. The apprentice at the prow shifts slightly, watching for a change in the ripples. The cargo lies under mats to shield it from the sun, sacks of millet, baskets of dried fish, perhaps a few slabs of desert salt. The day is hot, the river slow. Now and then, the pilot calls a soft instruction: left, steady, hold. Here each word is a stitch in the unbroken cloth of their journey. By the time they reach the next port, the apprentice will have added another few threads to his own mental map. In time, if he proves attentive, he will be trusted to guide the boat himself. And then the pattern will repeat. Another young man, learning from another elder, another map, living in another mind. But what happens when the chain is broken, when there is no apprentice, or when the river itself changes so much that the old knowledge no longer applies? This is the question that haunts the history of the Kaurifari. Their skill was never meant to be frozen in a book or locked in a museum. It was meant to be practiced, renewed, passed on. Without that living exchange, it dissolves, as quietly as a sandbank in the flood. Perhaps that is why their memory persists, not in the form of grand monuments, but in the way a modern boatman might pause before a certain bend, scanning the water for a pattern only he sees, or in the way an elder on the bank might point with his chin toward a channel he favors, offering no explanation beyond it runs truer there. These are small traces, but they carry the weight of centuries. And so the story of the Songhai River pilots is not just about the men themselves. It is about the relationship between human skill and the shifting world it must serve. It is about how knowledge can be both durable and fragile, enduring in spirit while disappearing in form. Standing here, on the bank of the Niger, you might think of the pilots as part of the river's own memory. Just as the current holds silt from places far upstream, it holds, in a sense, the memory of those who once read its every change, and it leaves you with a quiet question. If the best maps are the ones we carry in our minds, how do we make sure they survive when we are gone? Story 3. The Brickmakers of Jen and their mud-walled legacy. You wake to the sound of soft, deliberate thuds, the rhythm of wet earth being shaped by human hands. It is not the kind of noise that demands attention. Instead, it repeats steadily, as it has for centuries, until it becomes part of the background of life in the ancient city of Jen. Jen, in modern-day Mali, is famous for its great mosque, the largest mud brick building in the world. But the mosque is only the most visible expression of a tradition that extends far beyond its towering facade. For generations, the brickmakers of Jen have supplied the city with the simple, sun-baked rectangles that shape not only its skyline but its way of life. The story of Gen's brickmakers is, on the surface, a simple one. Take mud from the river, mix it with straw, form it into bricks, and leave them to dry under the Sahel sun. But as with most boring parts of history, the simplicity hides a web of skill, timing, and communal knowledge. The mud comes from the floodplain of the Bonny River, a tributary of the Niger. In the rainy season, when the waters rise, the floodplain is covered in silt-rich deposits. When the waters recede, the ground left behind is perfect for brickmaking, heavy with clay, yet pliable enough to be worked by hand. Men and women walk to the floodplain with wide baskets balanced on their heads, filling them with shovelfuls of this dark, dense earth. The walk back into town is slow, the weight swaying with each step. Once home, the earth is tipped into large pits or onto flat, open ground, where it is mixed with water drawn from the river. The mixing is done barefoot, with workers stepping into the wet earth and kneading it underfoot, a process as physical as it is tactile. The soles feel for lumps, for patches too dry or too wet, and the feet press and fold the clay until it reaches the right consistency. Into this mixture is added chopped straw, which will bind the bricks and keep them from cracking as they dry. Forming the bricks is a matter of rhythm. A simple wooden mold, rectangular and without a bottom, is set onto the ground. Wet mud is packed into it, pressed firmly into the corners. Then the mold is lifted away, leaving behind a solid, damp block. One by one, the bricks appear in rows, each nearly identical, each the product of practiced hands. This is not industrial production. There are no machines to churn the earth or bake the bricks. The pace is measured, dictated by the weather. On hot, dry days, bricks can be ready in just a few days. In cooler or cloudier weather, the drying takes longer. Rain can ruin a batch, melting the soft forms back into shapeless lumps. The brickmakers know the signs of a good brick: the sound it makes when tapped, the way it resists pressure under the palm. These are not qualities written in a manual, but passed down through observation. A child watching his father or mother work will learn them without realizing it, the way a person learns the smell of their own home. In Gen, brickmaking is not just a craft. It is the foundation of the city's identity. The great mosque itself is replastered every year in a festival known as the crepissage, when the whole community turns out to renew the building's surface. The same mud and straw, shaped by the same hands, go into this restoration. The mosque, in this way, is never truly finished. It is a living structure, as much maintained as it is built. Beyond the mosque, the houses of Gen rise in smooth, earth-toned walls that blend with the streets they line. Some are modest, others elaborate, with carved wooden lintels and rows of projecting beams that both strengthen the walls and offer footholds for maintenance work. All are made from the same humble bricks. The bricks are not eternal. Over time, wind and rain eat at their edges, and repairs are constant. A wall might be patched with fresh bricks after a heavy storm. A courtyard might be rebuilt entirely after decades of use. In this sense, Gen's architecture is as much about renewal as it is about construction. The brickmakers, though essential, rarely work alone. Their craft is part of a wider network of labor: masons to lay the bricks, plasterers to coat the walls, carpenters to fit wooden doors and shutters. Each role is distinct but deeply interdependent. Without brickmakers, there would be nothing to lay. Without masons, the bricks would remain inert piles on the ground. It is a craft that shapes time as well as space. To walk through Jen is to walk through layers of work. A wall from the 18th century might stand beside one rebuilt last year, both made from the same clay. A house might contain bricks that have been recycled from an older structure, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. To an outsider, these bricks may all look alike, but to the brickmaker, they carry signatures, the particular texture of clay from one part of the floodplain, the faint variation in color from a different drying season, the imprint of a mold made by a certain carpenter. A skilled eye can read these signs the way a pilot reads the river, and yet, like the work of the Songhai pilots, this knowledge is vulnerable. It lives in people, not in books. The best brickmakers may have no written record of their methods, relying instead on an unbroken chain of apprenticeships and family training. When a generation is lost, a fragment of the craft is lost with it. Still, the bricks endure in their way, not as untouched artifacts, but as the ever-changing skin of a living city. They weather, they are replaced, and in their place, new bricks take up the work. This is the quiet continuity that has kept Jen standing through centuries of political change, economic shifts, and environmental challenges. You stand now in the narrow street of the old city, your hand brushing the wall beside you. It is cool in the morning shade, the surface rough with grains of straw. Somewhere ahead, you hear the same steady thud of wet earth being packed into a mold. It is the sound of Jen breathing, slow, patient, and utterly unhurried, and it makes you wonder, if a city can be rebuilt brick by brick for centuries, does it ever truly grow old? The work of Gen S brickmakers begins long before the first mold is filled. It begins with the river itself, or, more precisely, with its retreat. When the rainy season swells the bonny river, the city's surroundings transform into a wide, shimmering expanse of water. Canoes glide between houses on the outskirts, and the fields vanish under the brown flood. People wait. They wait for the waters to peak, then for them to begin their slow withdrawal, leaving behind the real treasure, fine, silty mud deposited by the flood. The brickmakers know the river's rhythm better than most. They can tell from the color of the water, the smell of the air, and the feel of the soil underfoot when the flood is about to recede. They watch for the first small islands of mud to emerge, for the way the current slackens around the edges of the floodplain. Once the water has drawn back enough, the harvest begins. Harvest, that is truly the word for it, for they gather the earth much as farmers gather grain. Baskets are filled with dark, clay-rich soil and carried back to the workyards, where the season's production will take shape. These workyards are not factories, though they may look busy enough to be. They are open spaces between houses, shaded in part by woven mats or the overhang of roofs. There is no machinery to drown out the sounds of the city. Instead, the work is accompanied by voices, by the scrape of shovels, the slosh of water in buckets, the steady slap of mud being pressed into shape. The preparation of the clay mixture is as much about feel as it is about proportion. Water is added a little at a time, never all at once, and the earth is kneaded until it reaches a smooth, pliable consistency. The chopped straw is worked in gradually, binding the mass together. This part of the process often involves many hands, men, women, even older children, working side by side, chatting as they tread the mixture underfoot. Once the mud is ready, the molding begins. Wooden frames, worn smooth from years of use, are set on the ground. A practiced hand can fill and lift the mold in seconds, leaving behind a neat brick whose edges hold firm even before it dries. Rows of fresh bricks begin to fill the yard, each one a soft, damp twin of the last. The drying process is deceptively simple. Leave the bricks in the sun until they are hard enough to stack. But in Jen, this requires constant watchfulness. A sudden rainstorm can ruin an entire batch, dissolving days of labor into formless piles. If the sky darkens, people rush to cover the bricks with mats or to move them under shelter. Drying also demands attention to the turning of the bricks. As they harden, they are flipped so all sides are exposed to the air. This prevents warping and ensures an even texture. The worker's hands are always assessing, feeling for patches that remain damp, tapping the surfaces to listen for the hollow, satisfying sound of a brick ready for use. Once cured, the bricks are stacked in tidy piles, often near the building site where they will be used. Some will go into new houses, others into the annual replastering of the great mosque, and still others into repairs after the wear of wind and rain. There is no real distinction between old and new here. A house might contain bricks from 5 different centuries, each one shaped by different hands. The masons who lay the bricks are partners in the process. They know which bricks are best for the base of a wall, which are lighter and easier to use higher up, which have the right firmness for shaping around doorways or windows. They work in patterns invisible to the casual observer, alternating courses to ensure stability, adjusting mortar thickness to compensate for slight differences. In size. In the dry season, building work moves quickly. The air is hot, the sky clear, and the bricks harden in days rather than weeks. In the rainy season, construction slows. Maintenance takes priority, patching cracks, adding fresh plaster, reinforcing corners worn down by months of wind-driven rain. The entire city participates in this cycle, directly or indirectly. Even those who do not make or lay bricks know how to repair small cracks in their own walls. A child grows up watching his parents mix plaster for a courtyard wall, just as they grew up watching theirs. The rhythm of repair is as natural as the rhythm of cooking or planting crops. The crepissage, the annual replastering of the great mosque, is the most visible expression of this tradition. In the days leading up to it, brickmakers, masons, and volunteers prepare huge quantities of mud plaster, mixing it in open pits with shovels and bare feet. On the appointed day, hundreds of people swarm over the mosque's surface, carrying baskets of mud up wooden ramps, smoothing it onto the walls with quick, practiced strokes. Laughter and song fill the air. The work is both labor and celebration. The result is not just a refreshed building, but a renewed sense of community. Everyone contributes, and the mosque, like the houses, like the city itself, becomes a living thing, cared for and sustained by those who inhabit it. To an outsider, this annual cycle might seem repetitive, even monotonous, but to the people of Jen, it is part of the city's heartbeat. Each replastering, each newly made brick, is a thread in the long fabric of the city's life. And yet, as you walk through Jen, past the drying yards and the stacked bricks, you might notice something. There are fewer young people in the work yards than there once were. Some have left for the capital, for other towns, for work that does not require rising with the sun to mold clay in the heat. The knowledge still passes from elder to apprentice, but the chain is thinner now, the links more fragile. The question lingers in the air like the heat rising from the floodplain. When a city's walls depend on the hands of its people, what happens? when fewer hands remain. To understand Gen's brickmakers fully, you have to stand still for a while, long enough to watch the slow rhythm of their work, to see how it fits into the pace of the city itself. The sound is steady, a mold being lifted, a brick thudding softly onto the ground. The smell is earthy, with the faint sweetness of straw. The feel of the air shifts through the day, cool in the morning, heavy and still by midday, light again in the evening, when the shadows grow long across the drying yards. In this unhurried world, the brick is both the simplest and the most important thing. It is a unit of shelter, of beauty, of history. Without it, Gen would not be. Gen, the great mosque, stands as the most visible testament to this legacy. Each year, when the crepissage begins, the city becomes a construction site, in the best sense, not chaotic, but purposeful. Children carry small baskets of mud, laughing as they splash it onto the lower walls. Teenagers scramble up the mosque's projecting wooden beams, plastering the higher reaches with practiced ease. Elders supervise, offering quiet corrections and advice. Tourists sometimes come to witness the event, cameras in hand, but the work is not for them. It is for the building, for the city, and for the continuity of a way of life that has lasted through centuries of drought, flood, trade, and political change. And yet, as with all traditions, this one is vulnerable. Climate change has altered the flood patterns of the Bonny River. In some years, the floods are too brief, leaving less of the fine clay needed for brickmaking. In others, the waters linger too long, delaying the start of the brickmaking season. Both extremes put pressure on the supply of material and on the livelihoods of those who shape it. At the same time, new materials have entered the market. Concrete blocks, imported and uniform, promise longer durability with less maintenance. For a family looking to avoid the yearly task of replastering, these blocks can be tempting. But concrete changes more than just the look of a building. It alters how heat is held, how walls breathe, how a house ages. In Gen's climate, concrete can trap heat, making interiors hotter, and it can crack in ways harder to repair than mud-brick. The brickmakers see this shift with mixed feelings. Some adapt, offering their labor to lay concrete alongside traditional bricks. Others remain committed to the old methods, not out of stubbornness, but from an understanding that the city's architecture is not just a matter of material, it is a matter of identity. Walk through the oldest quarters, and you will see why. The narrow streets curve to follow the contours of the land. Walls rise in warm earth tones, their surfaces textured by hand. Wooden doors, weathered and carved, open into courtyards where the air is cooler than the street outside. These spaces are designed for Gen, for its climate, its people, its way of life. Replace the walls, and you risk replacing the city itself. The preservation of this heritage is not just in the hands of the brickmakers. International organizations have recognized Gen as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, bringing attention and resources to maintain its architecture. But even with outside help, the survival of the craft depends on local will. A building can be repaired by experts, but the tradition of making the bricks, the feel of the clay underfoot, the precise weight of a mold filled just right, cannot be preserved in a report or a grant. It must be lived. This is why, even as younger people leave for other work, some return. They come back for the crepissage, for the shared labor that feels as much like a festival as a job. They come back because their parents ask them to help. Rebuild a wall because their uncles teach them how to flip a drying brick without cracking it. In these moments, the craft is renewed, thread by thread. One of the elders in the city, a man with hands as rough as the bricks he makes, once summed it up simply: the wall is never finished. The city is never finished. We are always building it. Perhaps that is the truest measure of Gen S endurance. It is not a city that tries to stand untouched through the ages. It is a city that expects to be rebuilt, brick by brick, season by season, generation by generation. Its permanence lies in its impermanence, in the willingness of its people to keep shaping the same materials into the same forms, knowing they will do it again next year. Standing now in the shade of a newly plastered wall, you can feel the coolness of the clay. The wall smells faintly of the river, of the floodplain where its mud was gathered. In a few months, the rains will come again. The river will rise, and the floodplain will be covered. When it retreats, the work will begin anew. It is a cycle as predictable as the seasons, as steady as the thud of mud into a mold. And it leaves you with a thought that is both simple and profound. If the measure of a city is in the care its people give it, then Gen S legacy is not just in its bricks, but in the hands that keep making them. Story 4. Why 15th century? Timbuktu librarians preferred goatskin bindings. You step into a room that smells faintly of leather, dust, and something else, a scent that suggests time itself has been soaking into these walls for centuries. This is not a grand marble library with echoing halls. This is Timbuktu in the 15th century, and the library you've entered is a modest, dimly lit room in a scholar's house. Its walls lined with wooden shelves stacked with handwritten manuscripts. To most visitors, the first thing to notice is the paper, thick, slightly rough sheets covered in beautiful, looping Arabic script. But to a 15th century Timbuktu librarian, the first thing to consider was the binding. And more often than not, that binding was made from goatskin. Why goatskin? The answer is not dramatic, but it is deeply practical, and it tells you something about how Timbuktu scholars thought about the preservation of knowledge. Goats were everywhere in the Sahel. They were hardy, able to graze on sparse vegetation, and they provided meat, milk, and hides. The hides, once cleaned and tanned, produced a supple yet durable leather. For a region where importing fine calfskin parchment from North Africa could be costly and unreliable, goatskin was the obvious choice. The librarians of Timbuktu were not only keepers of books, they were also part-time bookbinders. Manuscripts arrived in the city from many places: Egypt, Morocco, Andalusia, and some were copied locally by scribes. A book might arrive unbound, its loose pages tied together with string or bound in a simple wrap that wouldn't last in the dry, dusty climate. The librarians, often working with local artisans, would rebind these works in goatskin to protect them from wear. The process began with the tanning of the hide. Goatskin tanning in Timbuktu was a craft in itself, carried out in small yards where hides were soaked, scraped, and softened. Natural tannins from local plants gave the leather a warm, earthy color and a faint scent that lingered for years. Once ready, the leather could be cut to size, sewn, and fitted around the manuscript's pages. Goatskin had several advantages. It was light enough not to weigh down the book, yet strong enough to resist tearing. Unlike untreated cloth or palm leaf covers, it could withstand the constant handling of scholars and students. And in Timbuktu's climate, hot and dry for much of the year, goatskin resisted cracking better than other leathers, especially when it was regularly oiled. Inside these bindings were works on every subject imaginable: theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, poetry. The city was a hub of learning, connected to a vast network of scholars across the Islamic world. But the manuscripts were not stored in a central public library. Instead, they were kept in private collections, sometimes hundreds of volumes in a single family's home. The librarians in this context were often the owners themselves, or trusted assistants, who cared for the books and oversaw their use. Handling a manuscript in Timbuktu was a careful process. Before opening the book, the reader might gently dust the cover with a soft cloth to remove any sand or grit. The goatskin binding flexed easily in the hands, allowing the book to open flat on a low wooden stand. Pages were turned slowly, and readers were mindful not to press too hard against the spine. The librarians were not sentimental about bindings. A goatskin cover might be replaced several times over the life of a manuscript. If the leather began to dry out or the stitching loosened, it was simply repaired. In some cases, a well-used book might end up with a patchwork cover made from pieces of different goatskins, each a different shade from years of wear and replacement. To modern eyes, these patched bindings might look shabby, but to the librarians, they were a sign of a book's value, proof that it had been read and reread, its contents shared with many minds. A pristine cover might mean a book had been neglected. The goatskin bindings were also practical in another way. They could be decorated without weakening the leather. Some librarians commissioned simple embossed designs, pressing heated metal stamps into the surface to leave geometric patterns or small inscriptions. These designs helped identify a book at a glance, useful in collections where many volumes looked alike from the spine. In the evenings, when the day's heat had faded, a scholar might sit in the courtyard of his house, a manuscript on a low stand before him. Students gathered around. The goatskin cover would rest folded back as he read aloud, the candlelight glinting faintly off the smooth leather. These moments were not rare in 15th century Timbuktu. The city was full of such gatherings, each one a small thread in a vast web of learning, and while the words themselves, the ink on the paper, were the heart of the matter, the goatskin bindings were the quiet protectors of that knowledge, enduring through the years so the ideas could survive. Still, the work of preservation was never finished. The Sahel's dust could work its way into even the tightest bindings. Termites might find their way to a neglected shelf, and so the librarians checked their collections regularly, cleaning, repairing, rebinding as needed. From the outside, this might seem like a tedious task, but to the librarians, it was part of their duty, as essential as copying a new text or teaching a class. Knowledge, after all, is only as safe as the materials that hold it. And so, in the quiet hours, as you imagine yourself sitting among these shelves, you might run your fingers over the warm, smooth surface of a goatskin cover and think, if the binding protects the book, who protects the binder? To understand the world of Timbuktu's 15th century librarians, you have to imagine the city as more than a dot on a map. It was a crossroads, not just of trade in gold, salt, and slaves, but of ideas. Caravans from the Sahara, laden with slabs of salt and bundles of North African cloth, shared the streets with traders from the Niger River basin carrying cola, nuts, rice, and smoked fish. Alongside these goods came news, stories, and manuscripts. The manuscripts were treasures in their own right, though not always in the way outsiders imagine. They were not locked in gilded cases. They were working tools. Read, copied, loaned, annotated, and the goatskin bindings that wrapped them were less about display than about practicality. A newly arrived manuscript might have been copied in Fez or Cairo, its pages filled with careful script on imported paper, but by the time it reached Timbuktu, it could have traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers in a saddlebag or on a camel's back, exposed to dust, heat, and the jostle of the road. The bindings it arrived with might already be worn. The local librarian would inspect it, and if the cover showed weakness, it was replaced with goatskin, a material they knew could endure the climate and the demands of regular use. Goatskins? Resilience came partly from its texture. It was supple enough to flex with the opening and closing of the manuscript, yet tough enough to resist splitting at the seams. Unlike brittle parchment made from calf or sheep, it could survive being handled daily in dry air without crumbling. And it had another advantage. It could be maintained. Regular oiling with natural fats kept it soft and prevented cracking. The process of rebinding was deliberate, almost meditative. First, the old cover was removed, and the spine of the manuscript was examined. If the stitching that held the quires, the folded bundles of pages, was loose, it would be reinforced or replaced entirely with strong thread. The goatskin was then cut to size, sometimes in one piece that wrapped around both covers and the spine, sometimes in panels joined by decorative stitching. Some bindings were plain, the smooth leather left unmarked except for the natural grain. Others bore subtle ornamentation, simple stamped borders, a star-shaped motif, or a small inscription noting the title or the name of the owner. The tools for this work were modest heated metal stamps, bone folders for smoothing, sharp knives for trimming. What mattered most was the care with which the leather was fitted in the quieter corners of the city. Leather workers and bookbinders often shared the same neighborhoods. The air there smelled of hides and tannin, of wood smoke from the hearths, used to heat water for soaking. Children darted between the work tables, carrying scraps of leather or lengths of cord. For them, the sight of a half-bound manuscript lying open on a bench was ordinary, just another part of daily life. The librarians themselves were not always solitary figures. Many taught students, and part of a student's education was learning how to care for a book. This included not only reading and memorizing its contents, but also protecting its physical form. A student might be assigned to dust a shelf, oil a cover, or check the stitching on a frequently read volume. These tasks were not considered menial. They were part of the discipline of scholarship. Goatskin bindings also adapted well to Timbuktu's particular style of storing manuscripts. Instead of standing upright on shelves, as in modern libraries, books were often stored lying flat, stacked in small piles, or placed inside leather satchels. This kept dust from settling deep between the pages and made it easier to transport collections when needed. The flexibility of goatskin allowed books to endure this stacking without warping, and they did need to be transported at times. Timbuktu's political fortunes in the 15th century were generally stable under the Mali and then the Songhai empires, but there were still moments when collections had to be hidden or moved. Goatskin covers, resistant to scuffing and light damage, were better suited than cloth or paper wrappings for such journeys. The libraries of Timbuktu were, in many ways, private affairs. Families guarded their collections closely, passing them down through generations. A respected scholar might leave dozens or even hundreds of manuscripts to his heirs, along with the responsibility of caring for them. In some cases, the goatskin binding on a book might be older than the person who inherited it. These bindings became part of the family's identity. Their wear patterns as familiar as the grain of a well-used wooden door. Of course, not all goatskin bindings were equal. The quality depended on the skill of the tanner, the care taken in sewing, and the attention given to upkeep. A neglected book could still dry out and crack, its corners curling away from the pages. In such cases, the librarian would either commission a new binding or salvage what could be saved from the old one. Sometimes, reusing pieces of leather for smaller works or, as reinforcement, strips inside another book's spine. What stands out in all of this is the quiet, ongoing labor. The manuscripts of Timbuktu did not survive centuries by accident. They endured because someone, often many people, handled them carefully, repaired them when needed, and wrapped them in a material that could live as long as the ideas it protected. And yet, there is an irony here. Goatskin was chosen for its durability, but it was also the most replaceable part of a book. The pages inside, once damaged, were far harder to restore. In a sense, the binding was both the shield and the sacrificial layer, meant to take the wear so the text would not have to. If you stand in one of these 15th century libraries in your mind, you might picture a scene in the cool hours before dawn. A librarian sits at a low desk, the faint light of an oil lamp falling on a spread of tools. Before him lies a manuscript with frayed stitching and a peeling cover. He works slowly, reattaching the quires, cutting fresh goatskin, pressing it gently into place. Outside, the first call to prayer drifts through the still air. The book will be ready by afternoon, its new cover supple and smooth. It will join the other volumes on the shelf, indistinguishable at a glance, but carrying in its leather the quiet story of the hands that made it whole again. And it makes you wonder if the survival of knowledge depends on such humble acts. How? Many stories are held not in the words themselves, but in the bindings that have kept them alive. By the late 15th century, Timbuktu had become not only a trading hub, but a beacon of learning for much of West Africa. The city's scholars taught students from as far afield as Morocco, Egypt, and the Hausa states. Its houses, many of them, modest in size, concealed vast personal libraries, some collections numbering in the hundreds or even thousands of manuscripts. Within these private libraries, the goatskin-bound books rested quietly on wooden shelves, inside leather satchels, or stacked in neat piles. Each bore the marks of use, creases in the covers, darkening at the edges where hands had held them, faint impressions from the straps used to tie them shut. The goatskin bindings had by then become a visual shorthand for Timbuktu's scholarship. Visitors could tell at a glance that a book bound in this way likely came from the region, or had at least passed through the hands of its binders. The texture, the warm ochre or deep brown tones, the occasional geometric stamp, these were signs of a craft adapted perfectly to its place. But even as the bindings became a symbol, they never lost their practical function. The librarians understood the climate they lived in. The Sahel's harmattan winds could carry fine dust into every crevice. The long dry season could make leather brittle, while the short rainy season threatened to swell it. Goatskin, when cared for, met these challenges better than most materials available at the time. Caring for it was a ritual in itself. Once or twice a year, the bindings were cleaned with a soft cloth, brushed free of dust, and rubbed with a small amount of oil, often from local plants, to keep them supple. This task was carried out in the cooler hours of morning or evening, when the heat would not cause the oil to evaporate too quickly. It was not unusual for family members, apprentices, or students to gather for this work, each responsible for a small stack of volumes. The process fostered a kind of intimacy with the books. A person who had oiled the same manuscript year after year came to know it almost as one might know an old tool, its weight, its scent, the slight irregularities in its cover. These small details anchored the book in memory, making it part of a living relationship between people and knowledge. And yet, the goatskin bindings were never considered sacred in themselves. They were replaceable and often replaced. A well-worn cover might be set aside and used for repairs on another book, its leather cut into strips to reinforce a spine. In this way, pieces of one manuscript might live on physically in another, a quiet form of recycling that left its traces in the city's libraries. The scholars of Timbuktu valued the durability of goatskin for another reason. It allowed them to share their books more freely. Lending a manuscript was always a risk. Damage could occur in transport or through careless handling, but a sturdy binding reduced that risk. In a city where knowledge was currency, the ability to lend without constant fear of physical ruin helped ideas move more freely. Travelers' accounts from the period speak of being astonished at the number of books in circulation and of the seriousness with which people treated them. A borrowed manuscript might be wrapped in cloth before being carried through the streets, and it was understood that it would be returned in as good or better condition than it was received. Goatskin made that promise more realistic. Still, no binding could protect a book from every danger. Fire, flood, theft. These were constant threats. And in the centuries to come, political upheaval would test Timbuktu's libraries severely. Many manuscripts would be hidden, smuggled out, or buried for safekeeping, and it was often the goatskin bindings that allowed them to survive these ordeals intact. Looking back from today, it's tempting to see the goatskin binding as just another artifact, an object to be displayed in a museum case. But to do so is to miss its real story. In the 15th century, these bindings were part of a living system, one in which books were used, repaired, and passed from hand to hand in an unbroken chain of scholarship. To stand in a Timbuktu library then would have been to feel the weight of that chain around you. In the dim, cool air, the shelves would be lined with volumes bound in shades of brown and gold. Somewhere a scribe would be copying a text, pausing now and then to sharpen his reed pen. A librarian would be inspecting a cover, checking the stitching along the spine, perhaps planning to have it replaced. The knowledge contained in those books on law, medicine, astronomy, theology has often been celebrated in histories of Timbuktu, but the bindings that kept that knowledge intact deserve a quieter kind of recognition. They were the first line of defense against time, the guardians that allowed fragile paper and ink to endure centuries in a harsh environment. In the end, the goatskin binding's importance lies not in its beauty or even in its craftsmanship, but in its ordinary. It was a humble, local solution to a universal problem: how to keep the past alive in the present. And as you imagine yourself running a hand over the smooth, worn surface of such a cover, you might realize something the Timbuktu librarians knew. All along, the value of knowledge is not only in the words, but in the care taken to keep those words safe. Story 5. Ancient river markets where salt was worth more than gold. It is early morning on the banks of the Niger River, sometime in the late medieval period. The air is cool, the sky pale with the first light, and the market has already begun to stir. Traders arrive by boat and by foot, setting down baskets, sacks, and bundles on the packed earth. The smell is a mixture of river water, woods, dried fish, and most valuable of all, salt. Today, the market will be measured not in coins, but in bars of salt, called amalek. These rectangular slabs, cut from the desert mines of Taudeni and Tagaza, far to the north, are heavy, coarse, and faintly shimmering in the light. To an outsider, they may seem unremarkable, just chunks of pale rock. But here, at this market, along the Niger, they are worth more than gold. This is not a figure of speech. In many parts of West Africa, salt was not merely a seasoning. It was a necessity for survival. It preserved meat and fish in a climate where fresh food spoiled quickly. It maintained health in a region where sweat could drain the body's reserves. In a single day's work, it was a trading commodity that moved across the Sahel in long caravans. And it was so valuable that people counted wealth in salt as readily as in metal. The river market you've entered is not in a single grand city. It might be near Timbuktu, Gao, or a smaller port where river and overland routes meet. The merchants here know the rhythm of the seasons, when the river is high enough for boats from downstream to arrive, and when the caravans from the desert will descend with their loads. The salt comes in with the caravans, camels in single file, each carrying slabs bound in twine, their surfaces chipped from the journey. The caravan drivers, many of them Tuareg, unload their cargo at the edge of the market, where porters lift the slabs onto their shoulders and carry them to shaded stalls. The slabs are stacked in neat piles, each one a silent statement of wealth. That gold comes from farther south, from the forests and river valleys of what is now Guinea and Ghana. Nuggets and dust are brought by traders who have walked or paddled for weeks. But here, gold does not outshine salt. The exchange rate can shift with the seasons, but in times of scarcity, one slab of salt might fetch more gold than you would expect. And gold, unlike salt, cannot keep fish from spoiling in the heat. Around the salt traders, the rest of the market hums. Women sell millet porridge in clay bowls, pouring it from large earthen jars. Fishermen display their catches from the river, tilapia, catfish, and smaller species laid out on woven mats. Cloth merchants unfold bolts of indigo-dyed fabric, the deep blue color standing out against the dust. Potters offer cooking jars and water storage vessels, their surfaces burnished to a soft sheen. The market is a place of negotiation, but it is not always loud. Bargaining happens in measured voices, with long pauses as each side weighs the value of their goods. A man trading a goat for part of a salt slab may step away to consult a friend, then return to offer an additional basket of grain. A woman selling smoked fish may adjust her price if she hears that the next caravan is delayed and that salt will be scarce for weeks. For those who travel here from far away, the first thing they notice is the diversity of languages. Songhai, Tamashek, Fulfilled Arabic, all drift through the air, mingling like the smoke from cooking fires. Trade depends on this multilingual world, and many merchants speak several tongues, switching effortlessly between them as they move. From one stall to another, the salt itself comes in different grades. Some slabs are pure and white, with a fine, even texture. These are the most valuable, often reserved for the wealthy or for long-distance trade. Others are rougher, streaked, with reddish or grey impurities. These are still valuable, but may be used locally, where purity matters less than quantity. Transporting the salt from the market to its next destination is a task in itself. Along the river, large pirogues carry it downstream to towns and villages. Porters load smaller pieces into woven baskets for short overland journeys. Merchants guard their salt closely. Theft is rare, not because it is impossible, but because the community understands its importance. A stolen slab would be difficult to sell without drawing suspicion. This market is not a temporary event. It is part of a network of exchanges that have operated for generations. A trader who sells salt here today might return in a month with grain, cloth, or cola nuts purchased with his profits. In this way, the market is both a physical place and a living circuit, connecting the desert to the river, the Sahel to the forest, one community to another. The value of salt here is practical, but it is also symbolic. To give someone salt is to acknowledge their importance in your life, to offer them health and preservation. At weddings, salt may be exchanged alongside other gifts. In certain communities, a traveler might carry a small pouch of salt as a gesture of goodwill when visiting another village. Standing in the shade of a cloth stall, you can watch a deal unfold. A caravan driver and a river trader crouched beside a slab, breaking off a corner to taste. They nod in agreement. The salt is good. The driver will take a measure of gold in exchange, and the slab will be carried to the river for loading. No one here needs to explain the terms. The value of the trade is understood as deeply as the river's own currents. It is tempting to imagine this market as a relic of the past, frozen in time. But for the people who live here, it is simply part of life, as regular as the rise and fall of the river, as necessary as the breath in their lungs. Salt may be heavy, plain, and without glitter, but here, on the banks of the Niger, it is the true measure of wealth. And as you watch the stacks of slabs growing higher in the morning light, you might ask yourself, when gold can be stored in a pouch and hidden away, why do people still treasure something so bulky, so hard to carry, so ordinary looking, and yet so essential? By midday, the river market is at its busiest. The early coolness has given way to heat, and the air feels thicker with each passing hour. Traders squat in the shade of their stalls, or under woven grass mats, their goods spread before them in neat displays. The voices of bargaining rise and fall like the sound of a tide, a steady hum punctuated by laughter, sharp retorts, and the occasional clap of hands to seal an agreement. The salt slabs, stacked at the northern edge of the market, catch the sun in a way that makes them glow faintly. They are heavy enough that few people carry them alone. Most are moved on wooden stretchers or balanced between two porters. As the day warms, the slabs give off a faint mineral scent, mixing with the smell of fish grilling on open fires and the earthy aroma of millet beer fermenting in clay jars. A merchant from the desert sits beside his goods, his indigo-dyed veil pulled over his mouth against the dust. He has traveled for weeks, guiding his camels along the dry routes between oases, each step measured against the memory of where water can be found. He speaks little at first, preferring to watch who approaches, weighing their offers before engaging. When he does speak, it is in a low, deliberate tone, as if each word is another item in the trade. Nearby, a woman selling smoked catfish negotiates with a boatman. She wants part of a salt slab in exchange for her catch. The boatman hesitates. He could wait until later in the day when prices might shift, but the woman reminds him that her fish will not keep forever, even smoked. Salt now means preserved fish he can carry upriver to sell in villages where such food is rare. The deal is struck, and a small wedge is chipped from one of the larger slabs. With a quick blow from a chiseled dot, the chipping of salt is almost a ritual here. A buyer squats beside the slab, examines its texture, and color, and then watches as the seller cuts a piece free. Some taste the salt on the spot, letting the coarse grains dissolve on their tongues. Others tap the fragment with a small knife, listening for a certain sharp, ringing sound that signals quality. At the opposite end of the market, a group of river traders unloads their They've come from downstream, bringing baskets of kola nuts, jars of palm oil, and a few nuggets of gold dust wrapped in cloth. The gold dust is measured with small, hand-carved spoons or weighed on delicate scales. But here, gold is less likely. To buy gold, it buys salt, food, cloth, and tools. The transactions move slowly. This is not a market where shouting and rapid deals are the norm. Instead, traders might sit together for an hour, talking about the river's height, the rains in the highlands, or the news from distant towns. These conversations are not wasted time. They are part of the trade itself, building trust and reinforcing networks that make commerce possible. Every so often, a caravan arrives late, and the mood in the market shifts. People drift toward the edge of the square to watch the camels kneel, their burdens unstrapped and lowered carefully to the ground. The new salt is inspected, its quality compared to the slabs already on offer. If it is better, prices may rise. If worse, the earlier arrivals gain an advantage. The entire balance of the day's trade can change with the arrival of one caravan. Salt's dominance in the market is not only about its scarcity, but about its role in the entire food system of the region. Dried fish from the river, smoked meat from the savannah, even certain grains all keep longer and travel farther with the right amount of salt. A merchant without salt must sell quickly, often at lower prices, to avoid spoilage. A merchant with salt can hold goods until a better opportunity arises. In this way, salt is both a commodity and a kind of insurance. There is also a social aspect to salt that is harder to measure but just as important. In some communities, sharing salt is a gesture of hospitality. To offer salt to a guest is to say, "You are welcome here, and I wish you health." In others, salt plays a role in sealing agreements, a pinch of it passed between hands as part of a contract. The market reflects these customs in subtle ways. Deals concluded with a small gift of salt on top of the agreed price, or a trader slipping a wedge of it into the basket of a long-time customer. As afternoon approaches, the light shifts. The sun angles lower, casting longer shadows between the stalls. Children weave through the crowd, carrying water in calabash gourds or helping their families pack up goods. Some traders begin to load their purchases into boats or onto donkeys, preparing to depart before evening. Others will sleep in the market town and trade again tomorrow. For those who remain, the market becomes quieter, but not empty. A group of elders sits under a tree, talking in slow, measured tones about the changes they've seen. They remember years when salt was so scarce that even the smallest piece fetched a fortune, and other years when caravans arrived heavy with it, driving prices down. They speak of times when gold was more abundant, yet still could not replace salt's practical value. Their conversation circles back to the same truth. Gold shines, but salt sustains. In this place, on the banks of the Niger, survival is measured not in wealth that can be stored in a chest, but in the ability to preserve food, to endure the dry months, to keep trade moving when the river runs low. The day's business wins. Down with the sound of river water lapping against moored boats and the soft crunch of salt underfoot, where chips have fallen from the slabs. In the fading light, The market looks much as it did in the morning, but the wealth has shifted quietly from one set of hands to another, and as you walk past the last stalls, you might ask yourself if gold is the metal of kings and salt is the lifeblood of ordinary people, which one truly holds a kingdom together. By nightfall, the market is no longer the busy, sunlit scene it was in the morning. The voices have quieted, the scent of grilled fish and millet porridge has faded, replaced by the cooler smell of river water and dust settling back onto the ground. The last of the traders have packed their goods, salt slabs loaded onto boats or strapped to pack animals for the journey ahead. Yet the space is not entirely empty. A few merchants stay behind, sleeping beside their goods, using folded cloths for pillows and the warm bodies of their donkeys or camels for shelter against the chill. The river murmurs softly in the dark, and the occasional splash of a fish is the only interruption. Salt slabs remain in neat stacks where the largest traders have left them overnight. They will be guarded, not with high walls or locks, but with the quiet assurance that everyone knows who they belong to, and that the community will notice if one goes missing. Trust, built over generations of shared trade, is part of the security here. In this quieter hour, the market's role feels clearer. It is not just a place for buying and selling. It is a meeting ground, a place where news travels, where alliances are formed and maintained. The movement of salt, heavy, slow, deliberate, shapes the movement of people and goods far beyond this square. A boat carrying salt downstream might stop at a dozen villages, each one taking a small piece in exchange: fur grain, fish, or woven cloth. By the time the last of that salt reaches its final port, its value has multiplied many times over. Not in coin alone, but in the sustenance and security it has provided. Salt's journey from the desert mines to the river market is itself a feat of endurance. The mines at Taudini or Tagaza are far to the north, in places where the sun can bleach bone white in a matter of weeks. Workers cut the salt from the earth in massive slabs, loading them onto camels for the weeks-long trek south. The caravans travel in long lines, often at night to avoid the worst heat, guided by men who know the desert's landmarks and the positions of the stars. When they finally reach the river, the sight of green vegetation and flowing watermarks, the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The river takes over where the desert leaves off. Boats carry the salt into regions where the people have never seen the mines, where the only image of that far-off land comes from the stories told by traders. In these villages, salt can seem almost magical, a gift from a place so distant. It might as well be another world. In the 15th and 16th centuries, when the Mali and Songhai empires controlled much of this trade, the flow of salt was regulated by tolls and taxes at key ports. Officials recorded the number of slabs passing through, ensuring that a share went to the state. This was not merely revenue, it was a form of power. To control the salt trade was to control the lifeline of entire regions. But here, in the market, away from the halls of kings and governors, salt's power is personal. It buys the fisherman more time to sell his catch, the cloth merchant more security for her goods, the farmer a way to store surplus grain. It turns perishable into durable, temporary into lasting. There is also a cultural weight to salt that is harder to see in ledgers. In some communities, a marriage is not considered complete until salt has been exchanged between the families. In others, salt is given to travelers as a parting gift, a wish for health and safety on the road. These traditions weave salt into the social fabric, giving it a meaning that gold, for all its luster, cannot match. As the night deepens, a few lamps flicker in nearby houses. In one, a trader sits cross-legged on a mat, counting small wedges of salt chipped from the slabs he purchased today. He wraps them in cloth, ready to be traded tomorrow for grain in a village upriver. His work is methodical, unhurried, the same work his father and grandfather did before him in another house. A woman places a small lump of salt into the cooking pot, the grains dissolving into the stew. That salt may have traveled hundreds of kilometers to reach her kitchen, passing through many hands and many deals. Yet here, in this quiet moment, it is simply part of the meal. Its long journey, invisible in the steam rising from the pot. This is salt's final transformation from a slab worth more than gold in the market to an ingredient shared at a family table. Its value in trade becomes value in life, in nourishment, in the continuation of days. The market will open again tomorrow, and the cycle will continue. Caravans arriving, boats unloading, deals struck, salt moving steadily from the desert to the river to the villages beyond. Generations will pass, but the rhythm will remain the same, so long as people need to preserve food, season their meals, and seal their agreements with something tangible. And standing at the edge of the emptying market in your mind, you might think of the weight of a single slab of salt, not just its heaviness in the hands, but its weight in history. It leaves you with a quiet question, the kind that lingers even after the market square has gone still, when something so plain can hold together the lives of so many. Is it truly ordinary at all? Story 6. The fisher kings of Mali who knew every river's mood. The river at dawn is a mirror, smooth and pale, broken only by the faint ripple of a canoe's bow. Mist curls above the surface, and the air is so still you can hear the drip of water from a paddle blade 100 paces away. This is the Niger, wide and patient in the early hours, and it is in these hours that the fisher kings begin their work. The title, Fisher King, was never written into law or carved into royal tablets. It was a name spoken with a mixture of respect and familiarity in the river towns of the Mali Empire. These were men, and in some stretches, women, whose mastery of the water went beyond the catching of fish. They knew the river's moods, its hidden channels, its sudden tempers. They could tell you, by the smell of the air or the color of the current, whether the day would bring a heavy catch or a long, lean drift in the 14th and 15th centuries. When Mali's golden trade drew merchants from across the Sahara, the Niger was not just a road of water, but a living calendar. It told the time by the rise and fall of its floods, by the return of certain fish species, by the shifting of its sandbanks. The fisher kings read this calendar as easily as others read a scroll. A typical morning began before first light. Canoes, long and narrow, were pushed into the water by bare feet that knew exactly where the riverbed dropped away. The paddles dipped in silence at first, for this was a time to listen, to hear how the water moved against the reeds, to catch the faint splash of fish feeding near the surface. Nets were stowed in neat coils, gourds for bailing tucked beside them, and spears laid along the gunwales. The fisher kings chose their fishing grounds with care. Some stretches were favored in the dry season, when the river was low and the fish were concentrated in deeper pools. Others were better in the flood months, when fish spread into the flooded grasses and shallow lagoons. They knew the breeding cycles of tilapia, catfish, and the elusive capitaine, a fish so prized that it often ended up on the tables of nobles in Niani and beyond. Their knowledge was more than instinct. It was an accumulation of generations, A boy learning the craft from his father would be taught not only how to weave and mend nets, but how to read the river's signals, the way the water darkened under certain cloud formations, the paths of birds skimming the surface, the position of floating debris that marked a hidden current. Fishing was, of course, a source of food and income. Fresh fish was sold in the riverside markets within hours of being caught, often alongside smoked or dried varieties that could last for weeks. But the Fisher Kings were more than tradesmen. They were custodians of the river's balance. In years when the floods were late or the fish scarce, they would agree informally but firmly to avoid certain breeding areas, giving the fish time to recover. This restraint was not written in any law, yet it was respected, for everyone understood that to exhaust the river was to ruin their own future. The Fisher Kings also played a role in guiding river travel. Traders moving goods between towns, sometimes, hired them to steer canoes through the trickier passages, trusting their knowledge of the currents and sandbanks. In the Mali Empire's complex network of trade, where salt moved south and gold moved north, these guides were the quiet links that kept the flow steady. Their canoes were works of craft in themselves, carved from single tree trunks and shaped for stability in both deep channels and shallow floodplains. Over time, a skilled fisherman came to know every creak of his canoe, every patch where the wood had been repaired. A well-kept canoe could last decades, becoming almost an extension of the fisherman's own body. Life on the river demanded constant adaptation. The flood season could transform familiar landscapes overnight, turning dry paths into waterways and hiding landmarks beneath several meters of water. Fisher Kings learned to navigate, not by fixed points, but by patterns, the direction of a current, the line of a ridge under the water, the way certain trees bent in the wind. They also knew the river's dangers, the sudden storms that could whip the surface into whitecaps, the lurking hippos that could overturn a canoe with one charge, the crocodiles that lay motionless until the moment they struck. Avoiding these hazards was as much a part of their skill as catching fish in the villages. The Fisher Kings were not ostentatious figures. They lived in the same mud-walled houses as their neighbors, ate the same millet porridge, and smoked fish. But their status was evident in the quiet deference shown to them, the way their advice on the river was rarely questioned, the way their sons and daughters found it easy to marry into good families. As you picture the Niger in those centuries, imagine a horizon of water and reeds, the sun just breaking over the edge, and a line of canoes slipping silently downstream. In each, a figure stands at the stern, paddle in hand, eyes fixed on the currents ahead. This is a Fisher King, a person whose authority comes not from a crown or a title, but from a lifetime spent listening to the river and knowing how to answer it. And it leaves you with a question to carry forward. If a king is defined by mastery over his realm, does it matter whether that realm is measured in land or in water? By midday, the river's surface shimmers with heat. The early morning mist is long gone, and the sun glints sharply off the water. For the Fisher Kings, this is the time for patience, a different kind of fishing than the active search of dawn. Nets already set in the morning now rest in the currents, marked by small floats made from calabash gourds. Some Fisher Kings will spend these hours mending gear in the shade of overhanging trees. The nets, woven from cotton or plant fibers, fray. With use, a skilled fisherman can repair a hole so neatly that the patch is nearly invisible, his hands moving in a rhythm learned as a boy. The sound is faint but steady, the pull of the thread, the soft creak of the stretched net as it tightens. into place, others will guide their canoes into quiet backwaters, where the current slows and fish seek shelter from the midday heat. Here, they may use spears instead of nets, standing barefoot in the boat for balance, eyes scanning the shadowed water. A sudden flicker below the surface draws the spear forward in a swift, precise motion. Fishing is rarely done alone, even though most experienced fisher king often works with a partner, a younger relative learning the craft, or a trusted companion whose eyes can scan a different stretch of water. In the hottest months, these partnerships are also a form of safety. A man who falls into the river where crocodiles are known to lurk will have little time to pull himself out. A companion's quick hands can mean the difference between life and death. The midday hours are also for trading and news. Canoes may pull alongside each other in midstream, their occupants exchanging greetings and sometimes small portions of their catch. A fisherman returning early might trade a portion of his fresh fish for dried meat or grain from another. News of the river travels this way, too. Word of a sandbank forming near a ferry crossing, or of hippos moving into a channel used by traders. When the fisher kings speak of the river's moods, they mean more than the daily changes in current or wind. They mean the way the river changes over weeks and months, the shifts in fish migration, the arrival of floodwaters from the far-off highlands. Some of this is predictable, tied to the seasons and the rains, but some is subtle, noticed only by those who spend every day on the water. One might notice that the fish are biting later in the morning than usual, a sign that the water temperature has changed. Another might see that the usual flocks of certain birds are absent from a stretch of river, meaning the fish they feed on have moved. These signs are not written anywhere. They exist only in the minds of the fisher kings, passed from elder to apprentice in conversations that often sound like small talk but are, in fact, lessons. The fisher king's role as river guides is also most in demand at this time of year, when the water level is in transition, too low for deep draft boats to pass freely, too high to expose all the hidden hazards. Merchants carrying gold dust, cola nuts, or salt will seek out a respected fisherman to pilot them through difficult sections. Payment might be in coin, in a share of goods, or in a favor to be called on later. In this way, the fisher king's influence extends beyond their own villages. Alongside their skill, the fisher kings carry a sense of stewardship. They are not owners of the river, but they feel a responsibility toward it. Overfishing is discouraged, not by formal decree, but by the quiet pressure of community expectation. A fisherman who takes too much, or uses methods that harm breeding grounds, risks being shunned in trade or denied help in times of need. The balance is enforced by social ties as much as by the river's own limits. This stewardship extends to an awareness of the river's hazards for others. When a sandbank shifts near a well-used crossing, the fisher kings will be among the first to mark it with a branch or a cluster of reeds, warning travelers to steer clear. When a dangerous animal takes up residence near a fishing ground, word will travel quickly through their networks in the markets. The presence of a fisher king can be seen in the quality of the fish on offer. Their catches are sorted carefully, larger fish displayed with pride, smaller ones sold in bundles for household meals. Fresh fish might be sold whole, while some are smoked over low fires in the market itself, the scent drifting through the stalls. The smoked fish, dark and firm, will keep for weeks and can travel far beyond the river valley. The money from these sales is not merely personal profit. In many fishing communities, a portion of the earnings goes into communal projects, repairing a shared canoe, replacing nets for younger fishermen, or hosting a feast at the end of the flood season. The Fisher Kings, with their experience and connections, often direct how these resources are used. As the day wears on, the river begins to cool again. Shadows stretch across its surface, and the breeze picks up. The Fisher Kings prepare for the evening's work, hauling in the nets set in the morning, checking the catch, and resetting them if needed. Canoes move steadily through the channels, their paddles dipping in unison. This is the most satisfying part of the day. The weight of a net heavy with fish, the glint of scales in the low light, the quiet exchange of words between fishermen. All are signs that the river has been generous. Even a modest catch is met with gratitude. The river, after all, owes nothing, and each fish is a gift taken with care. And as the sun slips toward the horizon, you might watch these canoes gliding homeward, their bows pointed toward the villages on the banks. The Fisher Kings sit at the stern, still reading the water, still alert to its subtle changes. It leaves you with a thought as the first evening stars appear. If mastery is not about bending the world to your will, but about moving with it, then who has more claim to kingship than the one who knows the river's every mood? Night on the river is a quieter thing than day, but it is not silent. You hear the steady whisper of the current against the hull of a canoe, the soft splash of a paddle raised and lowered, the low murmur of voices as fishermen return home. In the villages along the Mali Empire's great bends of the Niger, lamps flicker in doorways, casting warm light onto the water. The Fisher Kings land their canoes one by one, the bows nudging into the muddy banks. Children run down to greet them, eager to see the day's catch. Some will be sold immediately at the night market, where buyers gather to claim the freshest fish before dawn. Others will be taken home to be smoked or dried, adding to the household store. This is the part of the day when the work becomes social. The Fisher Kings talk with one another as they unload, comparing catches, sharing small details about the river. They might mention a new sandbar forming near the far channel, or that the water has turned slightly cloudier, a sign of upstream rain. Such information will ripple through the community by morning, shaping tomorrow's choices. Within the village, the Fisher Kings are not rulers in the formal sense. They do not issue commands or hold court, but their words carry weight in matters of the river, and the river touches nearly everything here. If they say that a certain channel should be avoided to allow fish to breed, most will follow that advice. Without question, if they warn of hippos or shifting currents, the warning is heeded. Their authority is rooted in trust, built over years of reading the river with an accuracy that few can match. In the households of these fishermen, the tools of their trade are kept with care. Nets are hung from the rafters to dry, paddles leaned neatly against the walls. Canoes are pulled partway up the bank to keep them from drifting off in the night, their hulls inspected for cracks or worn spots. The relationship between a fisherman and his canoe is one of mutual dependence. The boat carries him to the fish, and he keeps it in the condition to do so. The Fisher Kings also pass on their knowledge in the evenings. Around small fires, they speak to their apprentices and children, telling stories that are lessons in disguise. A tale about a fisherman who ignored the signs of the river and lost his entire catch is not just entertainment. It is a warning. A story about an ancestor who saved a trading boat from capsizing in a sudden storm is both a point of pride and a guide to courage. These lessons are often framed in the language of observation. When the herons gather at the bend before the market town, the fish are running. When the wind shifts just before sunset, The current will change direction by morning. These are not just sayings, they are the living memory of centuries on the water, condensed into words that are easy to remember and pass along. The connection between the Fisher Kings and the Mali Empire's wider world was constant, if understated. Traders depended on them to move goods efficiently along the river. Farmers relied on their fish to supplement diets heavy in grain. Even the empire's political centers benefited indirectly from their skill, for without the steady supply of food and the safe transport they provided, the flow of commerce and communication would falter. But the Fisher Kings themselves rarely spoke of empire or politics. Their focus was local, bound to the bends and channels they knew best. If they thought about the emperor in Niani or the traders on distant caravan routes, it was as part of a larger web in which their own stretch of river was just one thread, but a thread they were determined to keep strong. Sometimes the river took as much as it gave. A canoe overturned in a sudden squall, a net lost to the current, a catch ruined by an unexpected shift in weather. Losses were part of the life, accepted with the same calm as a good day's abundance. The Fisher Kings knew that the river owed no one a living. They earned theirs by working with its moods, not against them. In this way, they embodied a kind of kingship, different from that of gold-crowned rulers. Their domain was not fixed land, but moving water. Their wealth was measured, not in treasure, but in skill, reputation, and the quiet respect of their peers. And their legacy was not built in monuments, but in the habits and knowledge passed down to those who would take their place. As the night deepens, the river becomes a broad ribbon of reflected starlight. Somewhere out in the dark, a fish leaps, the splash echoing faintly across the water. The canoes are drawn up on the shore, the paddles set aside, the nets coiled for another day. Tomorrow, the Fisher Kings will rise before the sun once more. They will read the water, feel the wind, listen for the subtle signs that only they seem to hear. And the cycle will continue, as it has for generations. A quiet reign over a restless realm, and as you stand in your mind on the riverbank, watching the dark water slide past, you might wonder if the truest form of power is to live in balance with what you cannot control. Then were these Fisher Kings not rulers in the purest sense of the word?